So today's scholarly snippet session is on scientific research writing tips. I am Meghan Rito from PCOM Georgia, and I am thrilled to be able to be talking to you about this today, starting off the year with a good start, writing tips. So about this workshop, Scholar Snippets is a series organized by librarians at osteopathic medical schools to help you advance your research skills and support your scholarly activities. Audience, everyone, basically. The objectives for this workshop are to be able to analyze writing to make sure that it's clear, concise, and clean. And at this moment, we are just going to ask you a quick poll to see who our audience is today. Okay, thank you very much for filling out that quick poll. So let's get started into the sections of a scientific paper. You're probably all very well aware of this, that the sections include abstract, introduction, review of literature, methodology or materials and methods, results, discussion, conclusion, and your appendixes, references, etc. And just as a side note, if you're ever struggling like, well, I have my topic, I have all my research done, how do I get started? I suggest that you actually get started by literally writing an outline and start by writing out these sections and then start writing bullet points under each section and then start filling in the gaps in between the bullet points. And by that way, it's a much easier way to start. I actually normally advise that the last sections you write are the abstract, introduction, and conclusion. And we'll get to a bit of why that is in a bit. But yes, so when you're creating an outline, stick to this basic outline. It doesn't really have to be comprehensive, but you do want to know what you want to write before you start writing. And in that way, it helps prevent tangents, other pieces of writings you'll have to later anyway. In your writing, everything should be focused, which means everything you put in your paper should have a purpose. Does it directly help prove your support your thesis? If yes, or it disproves it, in other words, make sure that there's a reason for everything you put in your paper. And I'm going to start by going over some tips for when you're writing things like your abstract, your title. So for title, you want to keep the title simple and specific enough to describe the content, but make sure it's not too technical or have too much jargon. You do want to try and make your title concise, but it also needs to be clear. And by that, I mean, it needs to describe what your paper is actually about. Don't make it so concise that no one has any idea what your title is actually about, because after all, the title and abstract are the very first things people are going to see. So an abstract tips. As I just said, it's one of the very first things people will read about your paper. It will decide whether or not they actually want to read your paper. So it does need to grab the reader's attention. However, you need to resist the urge to cram every single detail that is in your paper in your abstract. Additionally, your abstract should never contain material that you don't actually talk about in your paper. In other words, it only reflects what's in your actual paper. So introductions. You do need to introduce the introductions. This is, of course, the background of your paper. And it needs to focus on the most important issues. Again, this is a section where I very often see people going off on tangents. If you can't come up with a direct reason why your reader needs to know this piece of background information, take it out. Your introduction should also provide clear descriptions of what your paper is about. You want to start simple, grow advanced, but also consider your audience. How simple do you need to start and how advanced do you need to continue in your introduction? A literature review, tips about literature review. So a literature review is not a book report, and it is also not an introduction. This is the section where you are to basically you've read all the literature about your which impacts your topic, and this is where you get to analyze the articles and describe how other people's research contributes to your research topic. Does it support it? So, in other words, that's what we call parsing. All referenced articles should directly impact your research, your thesis topic. So you don't want to have any articles that don't. In other words, if you can't describe how an article in your literature review contributes to your thesis topic, it shouldn't be in your literature review. I see a lot of people struggle with parsing information, so I wanted to give an example of a pretty clear parsing information mistake. And this comes from a lovely article of writing and publishing a scientific research paper. In this first example, you can see they're basically just spitting out references. So they're saying, these first two individuals studied the diet of Chelodina longiculotis at various latitudes, and two other fellows did a similar study on a different species. What did that actually tell you? You know what species they're studying and that it had something to do with latitudes and diets, but it doesn't really tell you much. The second example here, we actually know that Chelodina expansa is a carnivore. It is a selective and specialized predator feeding upon highly mobile prey, such as crustaceans, aquatic bugs, and small fish. And then Chelodina longiculotis is compared to them. They are reported to eat a diverse and opportunistic diet. Much better way of parsing the information. So here's some more advice on keeping a organized paper. You want to optimize your sentence and paragraph structure. As much as possible, you do want to avoid long paragraphs and sentences. For better and for worse, people these days are used to short bullet points, and it does make it, when you're used to that, it makes it hard to read these long paragraphs and sentences. Now, while I would not advise putting in bullet points into your paper, you have to know your audience too. And as much as possible, avoid these long paragraphs and sentences. Each paragraph should have a unifying idea or concept which groups the paragraph together. Typically, you want to start each paragraph with an old idea, which has been talked about in the previous paragraph, and expand that old idea into a new idea. Use transitional phrases for sentences and paragraphs to aid the flow of thought, such as using however, in fact, unfortunately. Here are some stylistic tips on concise writing. In order to keep it concise, the best way is to use simple and direct language, sometimes referred to as plain language. It is especially important for abstracts to be concise, and I did put in the reference for that fact right there. One way of keeping it concise is to avoid adjectives and adverbs as much as possible. Is your research truly groundbreaking discoveries? Consider whether each adjective and adverbs adds actual meaning. Avoid adding padding in your writing with words such as very, really, actually, or carefully, such as we very carefully diagnosed or we very carefully did the research. Can you say it without using the word carefully? If so, take it out. Does it contribute to your actual sentence? And in general, this isn't always possible when writing scientific. You can show confidence in your writing by not using passive tense. Now, again, this isn't always possible. For example, you're doing research on mice. Mice aren't doing the active work there. So that's why I say where possible. Here's some examples that were taken from research about not concise writing. There have been papers recently that using overemphasizing words such as innovative, significant, and crucial. While it's important to signal novelty, don't overdo it. And this is my favorite reference. It's from 2015. They analyzed the use of positive and negative words in PubMed abstracts between 1974 and 2014 and discovered that the frequency of positive words in PubMed increased from 2% to 17.5%, which is an increase of 880% over 4 decades. Specifically, there were 25 words that were particularly used, such as robust, novel, innovative, and unprecedented. And these specific words increased in relative frequency up to 15,000%. So here are stylistic tips on clear writing. So clear writing is not always the same as concise writing. You want to provide clear descriptions to concepts. So you start simple and then advance the complexity only as far as necessary to get the concept across. You can simplify your word choices. Again, use plain language. Plain language is typically described as being about an 8th grade reading level, which coincidentally is the reading level of the general populace in the United States. However, there has also been research that says that most people appreciate a simplified reading level, no matter how much education they have and how smart they are. So you also want to choose the word that most clearly conveys your meaning. Eliminate unnecessary phrases and redundancies. Just because it's a fancier word doesn't mean it's the best word you should be using. I was talking with someone the other day and they mentioned that in English, there's typically at least 2 words that will mean the exact same thing. And in English, we tend to have a lot of connotations to our writing. There may be positive connotations, there may be negative connotations. You may also need to know what the connotations are when you're selecting the words. And here, and the last tip is to avoid filler words. What are filler words? Here's some examples of filler words. And if you want more examples, this is a lovely link to scitechedit.com, which gives pages and pages of examples. So for example, instead of saying any particular type of, you can use any, as a consequence of, because of, as a means to, just use to. As far as our own observations are concerned, they show, you can just say, we observed. Much simpler, much less wordy. So plain language isn't just the words you're choosing. They can also be applied to a paper. And when you do it, it's visual clarity. You want to have clear organization. And ways to do that are things like using headers. The headers help your readers scan your document to locate the information they need. In longer documents, you may think about adding a table of contents at the beginning too. Headings and table of contents improve readability because they make your content less intimidating by dividing it into chunks. One other thing you can do is create appropriate white spaces with adequate margins and spaces between sections. White space in your documents break up your text, also making it easier to understand. And also going back to headers, using headers also create white space, which is important. Typography is also very important. Typography is the fonts and other visual elements in a document that you are using. Some types of typography are easier to read than others. You always want to choose a style based on readability, not fanciness. Although I will also state that when you are publishing a paper, sometimes you don't have a choice about typography, but it's something to keep in mind. Visual aids, if appropriate, also are extremely useful for having a visual clarity to your paper. These include things like infographics, tables. Tables can make complex information easier to understand. They're useful for making comparisons and showing relationships without using a lot of text. I mentioned this briefly, but avoid jargon. Here's a few tips to avoiding jargon. You have to know, who is my reader? Because you always want to be writing for your readers. So you have to know what their reading level is, what their knowledge level is. Should I be using this term? Is this term common knowledge outside of my thesis advisor? You want to use familiar, concrete, non-technical words. If you must use a specific jargon term, make sure to define it to make sure that everyone knows exactly what you mean by using this word. Make sure you're using all terminology correctly. If you don't know all the connotations of a word, maybe you should use a dictionary. Consider using also a thesaurus, especially if you're struggling to think of a better word to use. I see this especially when people are paraphrasing. And as I said, use a dictionary if you're not sure of all the connotations of a specific word. So here's a few tips on grammar. When you're writing, write uniformly. This includes things like watching your tenses. If you start in present tense, keep your writing in present tense. You can also do things like, I've seen, use the same word. So instead of using doctor, physician, etc., it's okay to stick to just one term. In fact, it actually helps your readability, even if it doesn't look as fancy. If you have access to it, you can use Grammarly. I would say that with a caveat. So Grammarly is not designed for scientific writing. It can help, but it is not the end-all resource for scientific writing. If you are here from PCOM, we do provide Grammarly through the library. So that's why I'm mentioning it. To make sure your paper is clear, concise, you want to edit your own work. Read your own writing aloud. I don't know about everyone else, but I know that sometimes when I'm writing a paper, I actually think faster than I can type. So sometimes I will think a full sentence, but I may have missed a word or two, which makes the full sentence clear. So by reading your own writing aloud, you can actually hear the difference. And if you're still a little uncomfortable with that, get another human to read your work, because they will definitely notice a mistake such as that. Also, use the tools you have. For example, in Microsoft Word, they have editing tools. There's no excuses for not fixing a typo. And I've also just included just a note. If you want to set up the editing tools, you would go into Microsoft Word, File, Options, Proofing. You can opt to check just grammar or grammar and style, or both, in addition to correcting for spelling. Part of writing a paper and making sure that your paper is clear and concise are your references. You want to be able to keep track of your references, identify at what knowledge and articles are important for your research and why when you're actually reading. Download articles when you find them and keep them organized into folders. Just basically create a system for yourself that will enable you to keep your resources organized so that you can later find it. There is nothing more frustrating than hours later trying to find an article which you remembered that it said such and such, which would be perfect, had in your paper, and you can't find it. If you do the work in advance, you will save yourself much agony and frustration and work later. I always advise using a citation management software such as RefWorks. There's also, if you're at another college, you might have access to something like EndNote. If you don't have access to either of those, there are a few free citation management softwares, just so you know. And again, just have a system to keep track of what information is important for part of your research. If you don't know where to get started, I recommend open Google Docs, write down an article citation together with notes about how this particular article is relevant to your research topic. You do want to be able to analyze reference literature for quality. How do you know it's reliable? Well, here's a few things to look at. Where was the research published? What journal, etc.? When was it published? Has it been peer reviewed? Does the author have good credentials? And is the article free from bias? Example, anything sponsored by Coca-Cola on sugar and health effects is automatically suspicious. And this is just a small list, since that's not what the majority of this session is about, but it's somewhere to get started. Keep in mind also that there are 3 types of resources. You have your scholarly, trade and professional, and you have your popular journal. Each of these are very different types of journals with different scopes and what they are trying to cover and for whom. And you can see examples of scholarly journals include things like JAMA, Lancet. Trade and professionals are things like Contemporary Pediatrics, Health Management Technology. And examples of popular journals are things like Sports Illustrated, National Geographic, etc. There's also 4 different types of scientific literature, and they are primary, which is research about new data. Secondary, which is about primary. So these are things like systematic reviews, editorials, just plain old reviews. Tertiary, which is compiled mass data, such as indexes, almanacs, digests, and then you have your gray literature. Still perfectly legitimate, they are just unpublished. These are things like dissertations, government documents, and publications. As a librarian, I feel it is my duty to always remind people to cite. If you are not aware, plagiarism is derived from a Latin word meaning kidnapper. You don't want to kidnap other people's ideas. This is one of my favorite quotes. Citation is how we acknowledge our debts to those who came before, those who helped us find our way when the way was obscured because we deviated from the path we were told to follow. And finally, here is my final checklist to help make sure that your paper is clear and concise. Is it clear, concise, and coherent? Does it convey your message? Does it contain all the necessary information? Is there anything that can be cut out and still have it contain the compulsory information? Is the writing style consistent? Catch any mistakes you may have made while you were caught up in the completion of it. All good questions to ask yourself before you submit a paper. And just really quickly, here are a few good references and papers to read. And I know you probably didn't have time to read all that, but I will make my slides available as well as the recording of this. I did have a few questions in advance. This is one question that was not answered in the presentation so far, so I wanted to mention it here. I was asked the difference between a commentary and a review. So this actually depends on the journal, because some journals' commentary is another journal's review, but typically it is a commentary can be defined about being about one other person's work, while as a review covers multiple people's work. Did anyone else have any questions? Okay. Thank you all very much for attending. I do want to point out that we do have our next workshop on January 25th, which are tips for publishing a case report. And I think we will be putting that in chat together with, please fill out a survey to let us know how did I do today. And if you have any suggestions on future sessions you would like to see.
There was a question in the chat about whether or not you've used Microsoft Editor, and do you find that it's similar to Grammarly?
I have used Microsoft Editor. Both are going to catch grammar mistakes. Grammarly tends to do better about telling you about style of writing, and it does editorial. For example, with Grammarly, you can say, I want to have a very serious, scholarly, informative type of style of writing. And Grammarly will then look at your work and say, oh, well, you should change this phrase to make it more scholarly sounding. Microsoft Editor is a little bit simpler insofar as it catches your spelling mistakes and it's going to catch grammar mistakes. But it's not going to give you style suggestions. However, you do have to pay for Grammarly unless it's provided. So there's a lot to be said for free. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you very much, everyone, for attending this session. Question, is there any plan for grant writing?
I would say that at this time, I don't think any of the librarians who have participated in our Scholarly Snippets webinars have the expertise that I know of to talk about grant writing, but it's something we can certainly talk about and explore. Sorry to jump in on Meghan here, but
No,
I know
I appreciate that.
a lot of the people that are doing it. So, but
Yeah.
I can always ask about that particular topic, and please do include that in the survey, and that's something that we can follow up on.
Yeah, because even if we don't have the expertise, it might be possible for us to find someone with the expertise to give that
Exactly.
presentation.
Mm-hmm.
That's what us librarians do. Even if we don't know something, we figure out someone else who does.